They crossed the wrong black nurse. Her Korean Mafia husband paid them back. The tires didn't warn her. They never do. 1 second, Sade Hassan was stepping out of the elevator in the underground parking lot beneath the hospital. Her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a double shift, her ID badge swinging lazily against her chest, catching the pale fluorescent light on every sway. The air smelled like concrete and engine oil and the kind of silence that only exists underground, hollow, watchful, wrong. She was thinking about her feet, about how they had stopped hurting somewhere around hour 10 and had moved into something beyond pain, that numb, floating exhaustion that nurses learn to walk on like water. She was thinking about whether she had left her phone charger in the break room again. She was thinking about Hyun-woo, about how she hadn't really seen him in days, not the way she used to, not the slow, deliberate way he looked at her like she was the only thing in a room worth understanding. She was thinking about all of this when the headlights came on. Blinding, sudden, intentional. The car surged. Sade didn't think, she moved. Her body twisted just enough for the bumper to clip her hip instead of crushing her outright. She hit the concrete hard, pain exploding through her ribs, the air knocked clean out of her lungs. Her phone skidded across the floor, the screen fracturing on impact, the light still on. The car stopped. Doors opened. Boots on concrete. Heavy. Measured. Wrong one. A voice from inside the car replied. Careless. Almost bored. She's wearing scrubs. It's her. Sade's breath caught somewhere deep in her chest and didn't come back right away. She lay still, eyes wide, staring at the low ceiling of the parking garage. Not random. Not robbery. Targeted. And wrong. A security alarm blared somewhere above, sharp, intrusive, splitting the air. The men cursed, scrambled back into the car. The tires screamed again into the dark. And then there was nothing but the distant buzz of the alarm and the sound of her own breathing, ragged, shallow, alive. 32 minutes later, Hyun-woo Kang received a call he never ignored. He was seated in a private room on the top floor of an upscale restaurant, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating quietly beside his hand, surrounded by men who spoke softly but carried weight in every word. Men who did not repeat themselves. Men who understood that the most dangerous rooms are always the quietest ones. When his phone buzzed, he glanced at the screen once. Hospital. Something moved through his face. Not fear, not rage. Something older than both. Like a curtain dropping in a theater before the final act. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and said only 4 words to the room, in a voice so low and so flat it was almost polite. Clear the table. No one asked questions. They never did. Outside, the city continued its night, completely unaware that something precise and unhurried and deeply dangerous had just been set into motion. But to understand what happened next, you need to understand who Sade Hassan was before the parking lot, before the headlights, before Hyun-woo Kang became the reason certain men stopped sleeping. 6 years before the parking lot, Sade Hassan was standing in the rain outside a clinic in Houston, clutching a rejection letter she didn't deserve. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this one, where the wrong person gets targeted and the right person finds out, drop every week. You don't want to miss what happens next. 6 years before the parking lot, Sade Hassan was standing in the rain outside a clinic in Houston, and she was furious. Not the loud kind of furious. Not the kind that breaks things or raises voices or makes a scene in a waiting room full of people pretending not to watch. The quiet kind. The kind that sits behind your eyes and burns there steady and controlled, because you have spent your entire life learning that the moment you let it out, the moment you let them see it, you become the problem. Not the injustice. You. So she stood there, soaked through her jacket, rain hammering the pavement like something personal. A rejection letter in her hand, already soft at the edges from the wet, the ink beginning to blur. She had passed every exam, exceeded every requirement, scored in ranges that made her professors pause and look again. She had done everything right, everything more than right, because she had always understood that right was never going to be enough, that she would have to be undeniable, unignorable, airtight, and still. Administrative inconsistencies, the letter said. She knew what that meant. She had always known what that meant. It meant that somewhere between her application and their decision, someone had looked at her name, her face, her history, and decided that excellence had a ceiling and she had reached it. She crumpled the letter slowly, thought about her mother, about the years of sacrifice compressed into every semester of nursing school, about the nights studying under bathroom light so she wouldn't wake her roommate, about every patient she had ever steadied with her hands and her voice and her absolute refusal to be anything less than present. She thought about all of it, and then she heard the tires, a black sedan, moving too fast, too close to the curb, cut through a pooled stretch of rainwater and threw a wave of dirty water directly across her shoes, up her legs, cold and immediate and almost insulting in its precision. She spun around, ready. The door opened before she could speak. He stepped out immediately. No hesitación. Tall, composed, dark jacket already catching the rain. His apology came quickly but without the rushed, embarrassed energy of someone trying to escape the moment. It was calm, deliberate, like he had already decided that the right thing to do was stay until it was right. Different, some part of her registered. That's different. She refused his coat. He waited. She accepted. They ended up across the street in a small cafe. Steam rising from 2 cups neither of them had ordered intentionally. Rain blurring the windows into something abstract. And Sade Hassan, who never vented to strangers, who had spent years keeping the quiet fury locked behind professionalism and composure, started talking. About the rejection, the letter, the administrator's face, the years, the exhaustion of being excellent in rooms that had already decided what she was worth before she opened her mouth. Hyun-woo Kang listened. Not the way people listen when they're waiting for their turn to speak. Not with sympathy arranged carefully on his face like furniture. He listened the way someone memorizes a room before they leave it. Still, attentive, taking in every word like it was information he intended to keep. He asked one question the entire time. What would it take to fix it? Not, that's terrible. Not, you should fight back. Not, I know how you feel. Just that. 3 days later, the clinic called. Apology. Reinstatement. Priority placement. Sade sat with her phone in her hand for a long time after she hung up, turning the timeline over. The timing too clean, the reversal too complete. She didn't ask how. She already understood that the answer wouldn't be simple. And somewhere beneath that understanding was a quieter question. One she wasn't ready to ask out loud yet. Who exactly is Hyun-woo Kang? Here is what Sade Hassan knew about her husband. He woke before her every morning. Made coffee the same way, no sugar, a single measure of cream, then sat by the window for exactly 20 minutes before the day claimed him. He remembered the names of every nurse on her ward, asked about them by name, and never forgot an answer she had given him weeks prior. He was patient in a way that felt almost architectural. Like patience wasn't something he practiced but something he was built from. He was also, she had come to understand, someone the world arranged itself around. She had noticed it slowly. The way restaurants had tables ready before reservations were confirmed. The way certain phone calls made rooms go quiet. The way men who carried themselves like authority, men with drivers, men with lawyers on speed dial, would adjust their posture slightly when Hyun-woo entered a space. Not fear exactly. Something more precise than fear. Recognition. His businesses were legitimate on paper and beyond question in practice. Shipping, logistics, real estate, supply chains that moved quietly across 3 continents. He had built structures so clean and so interlocking that pulling one thread would only tighten the others. He didn't advertise this. He never advertised anything. What he carried wasn't weapons or titles. It was leverage, information, and a reputation so exact that people corrected their behavior before he ever asked them to. He had rules. Sade had learned this not through conversation but through observation, through the patterns that live in the space between what a person says and what they actually are. One rule, she understood, sat above the rest. No harm to civilians. She had never heard him say it directly, but she had seen its shape in the outcomes, in the way certain situations resolved themselves without escalating, in the way people who crossed lines near him seemed to lose ground quietly. Contracts dissolving, partnerships evaporating, doors closing without explanation. But were never, in all the years she had watched, physically hurt. He was, in the most deliberate sense, a man who preferred architecture to violence. At home, he was simply Hyun-woo, the man who left her coffee on the nightstand on her long shift mornings, who sat across from her at dinner and asked real questions, who carried her exhaustion with her without trying to fix it, just present, steady. There, the duality didn't disturb her the way she suspected it should have, because both versions were consistent. Both versions operated by the same internal code. He was not different men in different rooms. He was the same man, just seen from different distances. She had chosen, years ago, to trust what she knew over what she couldn't confirm. Not naively, not blindly, but the way you trust anything built on evidence, carefully, and with your eyes open. She knew he kept a second phone. She knew there were rooms in his operations she would never see. She knew that the reinstatement call from that Houston clinic 6 years ago did not happen by coincidence. And she had made her peace with the shape of the life she had chosen. Because the man who sat beside her was not dangerous to her. Was not dangerous to anyone who hadn't chosen to be dangerous first. That was the line. And for 6 years it had held. Until the night someone drove a car through an underground parking garage and aimed it at a woman in scrubs. Until his rule, the one above all others, the one that had kept a careful boundary between his world and the worst of what it could become, was broken. And not by a stranger. By someone who hadn't done their research. Someone who didn't yet understand what happened when Hyun-woo Kang stopped maintaining distance. Sade kept replaying the voices. Not the tires. Not the impact. Not even the pain, though the pain was there, a dull, insistent pressure across her ribs every time she breathed too deeply, every time she shifted against the hospital pillow and remembered, in sharp physical detail, exactly what concrete feels like when your body meets it at speed. It was the voices she couldn't stop hearing. Wrong one. She's wearing scrubs. It's her. She stared at the ceiling of her hospital room and turned those 7 words over and over like something she had found and couldn't identify. There was a specific kind of terror in them that had nothing to do with the car or the men or even the fact that she had almost died in a parking garage after a 12-hour shift. It was the certainty in the second voice. It's her. They hadn't been guessing. They hadn't been reckless or opportunistic. They had been looking for someone. Someone specific. Someone who wore scrubs and parked in that lot and moved through that building on a predictable schedule. Someone who was not Sade Hassan. She closed her eyes. Hyun-woo was seated beside her bed. Still, the way he always was when something was moving fast beneath the surface. He hadn't left since he arrived at the hospital. Hadn't eaten. Hadn't slept as far as she could tell. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who was not resting but processing. Running something through an internal system she had never fully seen and had long ago accepted she never fully would. His phone had buzzed 3 times in the last hour. Each time he had read the message, set the phone face down on his knee, and said nothing. The 4th buzz was different. She felt the shift before she saw it. Something in the quality of his stillness changed, tightened like a frequency adjusting. He read the message once, then again. Then he set the phone down and looked at the middle distance for exactly 4 seconds. The name in the message was Halima Sadiq. A nurse, mid-30s. Same hospital system, different building. Same height as Sade. Same build. Same habit of wearing her ID badge clipped to her left pocket rather than hung around her neck. Same scrubs. Same underground parking lot. Same shift rotation almost down to the hour. A woman who had, for the past 4 months, been quietly assembling evidence against a financial crime network running ghost contracts through medical supply chains. Falsified procurement records. Redirected government funds. A system sophisticated enough to require protection and exposed enough that someone had decided that protection needed to be permanent. Halima Sadiq had been preparing to hand everything over to a federal contact. She had told no one, but someone had found out anyway, and someone had sent men to make sure she never got the chance. The operator behind it wasn't a name Hyun-woo didn't know. He did know it, had filed it away months ago as peripheral. Minor. The kind of man who mistakes access to dangerous people for being dangerous himself. Sani Bashir. mid-level, loud in the wrong rooms. The type who built confidence on borrowed power and never considered what would happen when that power was no longer interested in protecting him. He had ordered the hit with the casual authority of someone who had never faced a real consequence in his life. That was the first miscalculation. Sending men to the hospital to confirm the outcome, that was the second. Hyun-woo stood slowly, walked to the window. The city moved below, indifferent and unhurried. Sade watched him. She had learned, over 6 years, to read the versions of him by the way he held his shoulders. Tonight they were level, quiet. That was not relief. That was aim. He wasn't concerned anymore. He was calculating. Hyun-woo did not make calls that night. He made a list. Not on paper. Never on paper. In the structured, methodical space behind his eyes where he had always done his clearest thinking. He began to map the system. Not the men. Not Sani Bashir himself. The architecture around him. The financial scaffolding that allowed someone like Sani to operate with confidence. Because men like Sani were never actually powerful. They were supported. And support, when you understood how it was built, could be disassembled the same way. Quietly, piece by piece, without announcement. By midnight, he understood the structure completely. 3 primary funding channels moved Sani's operation. Ghost procurement contracts routed through 2 shell companies, both registered under names that appeared legitimate on the surface and dissolved completely under 20 minutes of the right kind of scrutiny. A 3rd channel ran through a logistics firm that had, until recently, been useful to people Hyun-woo knew well. People who, when contacted before dawn with the right information and the right silence, made quick decisions about where their business was better placed. Hyun-woo didn't threaten anyone. He simply shared what he knew. Calmly. Completely. The way you inform a man that the building he's standing in has a structural problem, not to frighten him, but because the information is simply true, and what he does with it is his own concern. By the following morning, the first shell company had been flagged by a compliance review that appeared, to anyone looking, entirely routine. By the afternoon, the logistics firm had quietly redirected 3 active contracts. No explanation offered. No dispute raised. The kind of withdrawal that leaves no fingerprints because it requires none. Just a phone call, a revised document, a name removed from a roster. The second shell company lasted until the following evening. An investor, a careful, self-preserving man who had been peripheral to Sani's network for 2 years, received a single message from a contact he trusted absolutely. The message contained no demands, no instructions, just information. Clean, specific, and deeply uncomfortable. He withdrew his position within the hour. Sani Bashir noticed the first irregularity on a Tuesday. Payment that should have cleared hadn't. A supplier who had always been reliable stopped returning calls. Not rudely, not with explanation, simply stopped. He assumed a processing error. Made a note to have someone follow up. By Thursday, the note had become a phone call. By Friday, the phone call had become 3. By the weekend, Sani was sitting in a room with 2 of his closest operators, staring at a financial picture that had somehow, without noise, without warning, without a single traceable event, developed a series of quiet, devastating gaps. He was confused at first, then irritated, then, slowly, in the particular way that paranoia arrives in men who have always believed themselves untouchable, afraid, because there was no threat he could point to. No confrontation he could respond to. No enemy standing in the open where he could assess the size of what he was facing. Just absence. Things that had been there reliably suddenly not being there. Like a room where someone has removed all the furniture while you slept. And you wake up and everything looks the same but nothing is where it was. He ran through his list of enemies. He had several. He had always had several. That was the nature of the business. But none of them operated like this. None of them were this quiet. He made calls, asked careful questions, listened to the hesitation in voices that used to answer him without pausing. And somewhere in that hesitation, the shape of something began to form. Someone powerful had decided to look in his direction, and they had not looked away. The federal investigator's name had never appeared in anything Hyun-woo owned. No contract. No communication trail. No record of the dinner 3 years ago where a silence had been purchased. Not with money, but with the quiet burial of something that would have ended a career and a marriage simultaneously. It was the kind of debt that couldn't be quantified, only carried. Patient. Accumulating interest in the dark. Hyun-woo collected those debts the way other men collected assets. He called it once. The conversation lasted 4 minutes.
Nosrets. No ilaverat explanation.
Just a name, a location, and a phrase that landed in the space between them like something heavy set carefully on a table. It's time. The investigator didn't ask questions. Men in his position understood that certain calls were not invitations to negotiate. They were notifications. The decision had already been made. The only remaining variable was whether you were standing on the right side of it when it completed. Within 18 hours, sealed case files that had been dormant for 11 months were reopened. Evidence that had been classified as insufficient was reclassified. Analysts who had been quietly reassigned were quietly reassigned back.
No announcement.
No press conference. Just a system creaking back into motion. Halima Sadiq had been living like a woman who expected every knock on the door to be the last one. For months of that. For months of forwarding copies to encrypted folders, of memorizing exit routes, of sleeping lightly and waking earlier than she needed to because her body had stopped trusting stillness. She had built the case carefully, methodically, the same precision she brought to patient charts and medication schedules, because she understood that incomplete evidence wasn't protection. It was provocation. She had been waiting for the right moment. What she hadn't expected was for the right moment to arrive wearing someone else's bruises. When she heard what had happened in the parking garage, the wrong woman, the same scrubs, the same lot, the same shift window. Something shifted in her that had been locked for months. The guilt was immediate and physical, like a hand pressing against her sternum. Sade Hassan had been clipped by a car meant for her, had hit concrete, had lain in a hospital bed running through voices that were never supposed to be hers to carry. Halima sat with that for one night only. Then she made the call. She handed everything over in a single transfer: documents, recordings, transaction records spanning 19 months, procurement contracts with ghost company signatures, wire confirmations, internal communications that used careful language and still said exactly what they meant to anyone paying attention. Everything she had been carrying alone. Gone. Into hands that would know what to do with it. She felt lighter in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not safe. She wasn't naive enough to confuse the two. But lighter. Like she had finally set down something that was never meant to be carried by one person in silence. The raids began on a Tuesday. Not all at once, that would have been theater. This was surgical. A procurement office in the early morning. A logistics company by midday. A financial services firm by evening. Each one connected to the next by threads that had always been there, visible to anyone willing to look. Now someone was looking. Accounts froze. Contracts evaporated. Suppliers who had operated comfortably in the margins of the network began placing calls that went unanswered, and understood immediately what the silence meant. The system was turning on itself. And Sani Bashir, who had built his entire sense of security on the assumption that he was protected, that proximity to power was the same as possessing it, felt the ground shift beneath him in a way he had never once prepared for. He started making calls. The calls went unanswered. He started making other calls. Those two. And then, on a Thursday evening, Sani Bashir picked up a bag he had packed 3 weeks ago and kept under his bed like a man who had always known this day was coming and had never truly believed it would. He walked out of his apartment. He did not take the elevator. He was running. He just didn't know yet that running and escaping were not the same thing. They came on a Wednesday afternoon. 2 men. Unremarkable. The kind of faces designed to pass through spaces without catching on anything. Plain jackets, unhurried pace, the practiced casualness of people who had learned that the best way to be invisible was to look like you belonged. They signed in at the hospital's visitor desk with names that didn't match anything on record, asked for a floor, were redirected, took the stairs instead of the elevator. They never reached Sade's room. Hyun-woo's people were already in the corridor.
No confrontation.
No scene. The 2 men were intercepted quietly, escorted out through a side exit, and released, because Hyun-woo had given specific instructions. Not yet. He needed to know who sent them, and frightened men who had just been caught rarely needed much convincing to explain themselves. Took less than an hour. Sani Bashir. Not a kill order. Just confirmation. He wanted to know whether the woman in the parking garage was breathing, whether she had seen anything, whether loose ends needed tightening. Precaution. The kind a man takes when he's beginning to feel the edges of his operation soften and wants reassurance that at least this part is contained. It was the most expensive precaution he had ever made. Sade didn't know the details. Not all of them. But she knew Hyun-woo. She knew the specific weight his silence took on when something had moved from professional to personal, when it stopped being a problem to be managed and became something he had filed under a different category entirely. She had seen it rarely in 6 years. Enough times to recognize it. Not enough times to be comfortable with what it meant. He came back to her room that evening and sat in the same chair. Same posture. Same stillness. But the room felt different. She watched him for a long moment before she spoke. They came here, didn't they? Not a question. He looked at her steadily. They were turned away. That's not what I asked. He said nothing, which was its own answer. Sade exhaled slowly, carefully, mindful of her ribs. She looked at the ceiling, then back at him. At the version of him that surfaced rarely and never for long. The one behind the controlled voice and the buttoned jacket and the quiet authority that filled rooms without announcing itself. Don't lose yourself in this, she said. The words were soft. Not a warning or not only a warning. Something closer to a request. The kind you make to someone when you love them enough to say the thing that's hardest to say without knowing whether it will land. Hyun-woo looked at her. And for a moment, brief, unguarded, real. Something moved through his expression that had nothing to do with strategy or structure or the careful architecture of a man who had built himself to be unreadable. I won't, he said, but his voice carried something beneath the words that she recognized and couldn't argue with. It wasn't a promise. It was a calculation that had already completed. She had asked him not to lose himself. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the decision had already moved past the point where loss was the relevant question. This was no longer about containing damage. It was no longer about financial pressure or information leverage or the slow, architectural dismantling of a man's network while he watched and couldn't identify the source. Sani Bashir had sent men into a hospital. Into the building where Sade lay with bruised ribs and a fractured sense of safety, replaying voices in a parking garage that were never meant for her. That had reclassified everything. Strategy implied options. What Hyun-woo was moving toward now had only one. It didn't look like an ending. That was the thing about the kind of collapse Hyun-woo engineered. It didn't arrive with noise or spectacle. No sirens converging dramatically on a single building. No press gathered outside a courthouse steps. Nothing that looked, from the outside, like a reckoning. It looked like paperwork. It looked like Tuesday morning and Wednesday afternoon, and a Thursday where 3 men who had shared office space for 6 years arrived to find their keycards no longer worked and a federal notice taped to the glass where the company logo used to be. It looked like phones that rang out. Lawyers who stopped returning calls. A network that had taken years to build, quietly folding in on itself like a structure whose foundation had been removed from underneath while everyone was still standing inside it. The arrests came in sequence, not simultaneously. Deliberate spacing, each one giving the next man just enough time to understand what was happening before it happened to him. Time to panic. Time to calculate. Time to make the specific, catastrophic decision that panicking men always make, which is to protect themselves by offering someone else. Internal betrayal moved faster than any investigation. Associates gave names. Names gave documents. Documents gave accounts. Accounts gave everything else. The network didn't need to be dismantled. It dismantled itself. Sani Bashir made it 40 miles outside the city before the car stopped. Not mechanically. It ran fine. He stopped it himself on the shoulder of a highway that stretched flat and indifferent in both directions, because he had just looked at his phone and understood, in one scrolling minute of notifications, that there was nowhere the car was going to take him that hadn't already been closed. 3 of his contacts had been arrested in the last 6 hours. 2 more had gone silent in the way that meant they were talking. His primary account, the one routed through the logistics shell, had been frozen at 4:47 that afternoon. His secondary account 11 minutes later. His third, which he had told no one about and considered his actual exit, was gone by 5:30. He sat on the shoulder of that highway for a long time. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. One contact saved inside. No name, just a number. Below it, a message. Clean. 11 words. One call to make. One option left. Choose before morning. Sonny stared at it. He was not a man built for this kind of silence. He had always operated in noise, in the managed chaos of rooms where everyone was performing confidence and the most convincing performance won. He understood leverage as a blunt instrument, understood power as proximity and volume. This was different. This was a door with one handle and someone else holding it. He made the call at 11:14 p.m. He talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Names, accounts, locations, arrangements that had never been written down because the people who made them had understood that documentation was liability. He gave all of it. Everything he had spent years accumulating as protection, surrendered in a single night on a dark highway shoulder because survival, in the end, is its own kind of logic. Others weren't offered the phone. They simply stopped being findable. Sade heard about it in pieces, the way you hear about storms you weren't standing in. Fragments, references, the careful, edited version Hyun-woo offered when she asked directly, and the larger shape she assembled herself from what he left out. She sat with it one evening, alone, while Hyun-woo was in the other room, thought about the parking garage ceiling, the fluorescent light, the sound of her own breathing coming back to her in uneven pieces, thought about Halima Sadiq, who had carried evidence for 4 months in silence, sleeping lightly, trusting no one, waiting for a moment that kept not coming. And she thought, not for the first time and not without weight, that it could have been her. Not the attack. She already knew that. The silence, the carrying, the months of being a target and not knowing it, moving through ordinary days while something moved toward her that she couldn't see. Could have been me. Not just in the parking lot. In all of it. She exhaled slowly and let it settle into the past, where it belonged. Cities are efficient with grief. They absorb it quietly, redistribute the weight across 10,000 other ordinary moments, and continue. Buses running, markets opening, the particular noise of morning traffic filling the space where something terrible used to echo. Houston moved on the way Houston always did, with the indifferent momentum of a place that had seen too much to pause for long. Sade watched it from her window first, then from the street, then from the corridor of the hospital where she had lain in a bed 3 weeks prior, listening to her own breathing and replaying voices she was still learning to stop hearing. She returned to work on a Tuesday, slower than before, more deliberate. Not from the injury alone, though the ribs reminded her of themselves with every deep breath, every reaching movement, every moment she forgot and then quickly remembered. It was something else. Something in the way she moved through rooms now, the way she noticed exits and paused at elevator doors a half-second longer than she used to. She didn't call it fear. She called it knowledge. The particular kind that lives in the body after the mind has already processed everything it can and still can't make it neat. Her patients didn't notice. She made sure of that. But her colleagues did, in the way people notice when someone has been somewhere difficult and returned not broken but altered. Quieter in a way that felt earned. More present somehow even as she held more back. She was different. Stronger in the places the fractures had been. Hyun-woo was different too. Not in ways that would register to anyone outside their life together. He was still composed. Still precise. Still the version of himself that filled rooms quietly and said things once and never needed to repeat them. But he came home earlier. Stayed longer. Put his phone face down at dinner without her asking. Asked her questions she had answered before. Not because he'd forgotten, but because he wanted to hear her voice moving through familiar territory. Safe territory. He made small adjustments with the deliberateness of a man who had looked directly at the cost of distance and decided he was no longer willing to pay it. She noticed. She didn't comment. Some things between them had always lived in the space beneath language, understood completely and better left there. Then one evening he placed something on the table between them. A phone. Not his regular phone. The second one, the one with no case, no personalization, the one that had always meant late calls and careful conversations, and the version of him that existed outside the life they had built together. The one she had learned early not to ask about directly. He slid it across the table toward her. Didn't speak. Sade looked at it for a long moment. At the blank screen. At what it represented, the distance, the parallel life, the parts of him she had accepted without ever fully holding. Then she stood, walked to the window, and dropped it in the trash without ceremony. Without drama. The way you discard something whose purpose has simply ended. When she came back, she sat beside him. Close enough to feel the slow rhythm of his breathing, the particular warmth of someone you have chosen again and again across years and difficulty and all the versions of yourself that neither of you planned for. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some endings don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly the way this one did, not in a courtroom or a confrontation, not in the final moment Sani Bashir made his choice, not in the raids or the evidence or the collapsed network. But here, in the silence of a room where two people had returned to each other and decided, without words, that what remained was enough. More than enough. They didn't start a war. They ended one. Because the men in that parking garage had made the only mistake that ever truly costs everything. They chose wrong.